I think there comes a point where learning more about yourself stops changing very much. You can spend months, even years, reading about psychology, watching videos, listening to people explain attachment or anxiety or childhood or whatever it is you are trying to understand. And eventually you become pretty good at explaining yourself. You know why certain situations make you uncomfortable. You know why you overthink. You know why you shut down around certain people. You know where some of your habits probably came from. And that's useful. I don't want to dismiss any of it, because sometimes understanding yourself for the first time is a huge relief. There are things we blame ourselves for until somebody gives us the language to understand them. But then something strange happens. You know all of this, and your actual life can remain almost exactly the same. You still avoid the conversation. You still don't go somewhere because you're anxious about who will be there. You still let someone cross a boundary and then spend the drive home thinking about everything you should have said. You still have things you've wanted to begin for 2 years. And at some point I think we have to admit that knowing better and living better are not the same thing. And maybe this sounds obvious, it probably is obvious, but I don't think we always live as though it's obvious. Learning can give you this feeling that something is happening. You read a sentence that explains something you've felt since you were 15, and you sit there for a second thinking, wow, that's exactly it. And you genuinely do see yourself differently afterward. The problem is that a realization can feel so important that we expect our behavior to somehow follow it automatically. Usually it doesn't. Monday comes and you're still nervous. The person who makes you uncomfortable is still there. The phone call still has to be made. Your room still needs cleaning. The thing you've been putting off is still sitting exactly where you left it. I think that's where you find out whether something you learned has actually become part of you. It has to leave your head eventually. If you've spent your whole life being afraid of confrontation, learning about boundaries probably isn't going to make your first real boundary feel good. You may say it badly, you might over-explain yourself, your voice might shake a little, and then afterward you might spend half the night wondering whether you were too harsh. That doesn't necessarily mean the boundary was wrong. It might simply mean you've had 20 years of practice staying quiet and about 30 seconds of practice speaking up. Of course, one of those is going to feel more natural. I think we underestimate how much familiarity influences what we call ourselves. We say, that's just not me, when sometimes what we really mean is, I've never practiced being that person. Maybe you've always been shy. Maybe you're the person who never causes a problem. Maybe you're the one who always goes along with the plan. Maybe you're someone who leaves before anybody has the opportunity to reject you. After enough time, these things stop feeling like behaviors. They start feeling like personality. So when you try something different, there can be a strange feeling that you're being fake. I used to think that if change was right, eventually I would feel ready for it first. I don't really believe that anymore. There are things I knew I needed to do long before I wanted to do them. I wasn't waiting for an answer. If I'm honest, I already had the answer. I was waiting for the answer to become comfortable. Sometimes that waiting can go on for years, and learning can become part of the waiting. Another book, another video, another person telling you why you think the way you think, another explanation of your past. Again, none of those things are bad. The problem begins when understanding becomes a place to hide from experience. You can understand courage without doing anything courageous. You can know why you are anxious and still arrange your entire life around never feeling anxious. You can spend years learning about self-respect while repeatedly returning to a person who makes you feel small. Eventually, life asks a slightly different question. Okay, you understand. What are you going to do? And I think the answer is usually much less dramatic than we want it to be. Real change tends to happen in these almost unimpressive moments. You go somewhere even though you feel awkward. You finally send something you've been working on instead of fixing it for the 100th time. You say what you actually think. You don't send the text. You sit with an uncomfortable feeling for 10 minutes without immediately trying to escape it. Nobody sees most of this. There isn't necessarily some huge sense of accomplishment afterward either. Sometimes you just feel uncomfortable, but you've done something important. You've given yourself an experience your mind didn't have before. Let's say you're terrified of speaking up because some part of you believes that disagreement means people will leave. You can read for months about where that fear came from, and maybe you should. But then one day you disagree with somebody you care about. It's uncomfortable. Maybe the conversation isn't even particularly graceful, and they don't leave. Now you know something differently. You don't just know it as an idea anymore. Something actually happened to you, and you need enough of those experiences. That's the part that isn't very exciting. You do it again, then again. You still overthink sometimes, you still retreat sometimes. There are probably days when you go straight back to an old habit and wonder whether you've changed at all. But slowly, the thing that used to require an entire argument inside your head becomes a little less dramatic. I think this is one of the strangest parts of changing as a person. The changes you once wanted desperately can eventually become so normal that you stop noticing them. One day, somebody takes 3 hours to text you back, and you realize you didn't spend those 3 hours wondering what you did wrong. You walk into a room where you don't know anybody and you're nervous, but you're okay. Someone is disappointed with you, and you don't immediately abandon your own decision to make them comfortable. Maybe you see somebody you haven't seen in 2 or 3 years, and they notice it before you do. You're different. Everything you've learned. Actually, you probably don't feel much need to explain it anymore. It's just there, in the way you speak, in what bothers you and what doesn't, in what you say yes to, in what you can finally leave alone. I think that's when knowledge becomes wisdom, if we want to use that word. When you don't have to keep talking about it. It has entered your behavior, and there's something humbling about that, because it means that you cannot think your way through every part of becoming who you want to become. Eventually, your life has to participate. The books matter. Therapy can matter. Philosophy matters. Conversations matter. Sometimes one piece of information genuinely changes the direction of your life. But that information still has to meet you somewhere on an ordinary Wednesday. It has to survive embarrassment and uncertainty and somebody not liking what you said. It has to survive the moment when your anxiety is actually happening rather than when you're calmly reading about anxiety in bed. That's where it becomes yours. So maybe there isn't always something else you need to discover about yourself. Maybe you already know enough to take the next step. Not everything. Nobody knows everything, and you don't have to completely understand yourself before you're allowed to move. There is probably one thing in your life right now that you have thought about enough. A conversation, a decision, somewhere you want to go, something you need to stop returning to, something small you've managed to make enormous by thinking about it every day. You probably don't need another perfect sentence about it. You may just need to see what happens when you finally do something, and perhaps that's the uncomfortable limit of knowledge. It can take you all the way to the door. At some point, you still have to open it.